Freya Whitlock had scrubbed other people's floors for 5 years, and her hands knew the smell of bleach better than they knew her own brother's handwriting. But no amount of honest work had ever bought her what she needed most, which was a heart strong enough to keep 16-year-old Arlo breathing past the spring. The boy's name was buried somewhere on a transplant list 3,000 names deep, lost behind a wall of lapsed insurance and paperwork that had failed him through no fault of his own, and the doctors had stopped using the word hope the way you stop saying a name at a funeral. So when a stranger in a hospital waiting room leaned close and whispered that there was a man in this city who could arrange the impossible, a man whose price was never money, Freya wrote the name down on the back of a parking ticket and told herself she'd never use it. She used it 9 days later. The estate sat behind iron gates on the cold edge of Lake Michigan, and the man waiting by the fire didn't look like a monster, which was somehow worse. Constantine Vale was 37, dressed in a suit that cost more than a year of her wages, with gray eyes that took her apart without moving, and a stillness that belonged to something far older than him. He owned half the things in Chicago that respectable people pretended didn't exist, and he listened to her beg for her brother's life without blinking once. Then he told her his price, not her savings, because she didn't have any, not her body, because he said he had no use for what was taken. He wanted her fully, in his house and under his rule, the way a fan claims a thing he intends to keep. And he gave her one rule, just one, spoken so softly she almost missed how strange it was. She could clean his floors, pour his wine, and live every day inside his world. But she could never, under any circumstance, fall in love with him, because the moment she did, everything keeping her brother alive would simply stop. Freya thought it would be the easiest promise she'd ever make. She didn't know that the one rule he swore would protect them both was the very thing built to break them, or that the lie beneath it had a dead woman's name on it. If a story about an impossible bargain and a man hiding behind his own cruelty pulls at something in you, go ahead and tap that like button. Share this with someone who loves a dangerous romance, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's step back into that house on the lake, where a maid in a borrowed dress is about to sign her name in red ink and learn exactly what she's traded away. Constantine Vale's fountain pen felt strangely heavy in Freya's hand, and when the final stroke of red ink in her signature dried on the thick, cream-colored page, she felt as though she had signed her name not on a contract, but on the gravestone of her former self. The man sitting across from her said nothing. He only lifted the paper, blew softly over the still damp line of ink, as though coaxing something to sleep, then slipped it into a black leather briefcase she would never be allowed to touch. 4 days later, in a place whose name she was not permitted to know, beneath surgical lights she only glimpsed through the crack of a door, her Arlo was given a new heart. They did not let her into the recovery room. She stood outside the thick glass, her calloused hands pressed against the cold surface, watching the boy's thin chest rise and fall to the rhythm of something that no longer belonged only to him, and she cried the way people cry when they have been granted a miracle and robbed of everything in the very same breath. A nurse quietly drew the curtain after a few minutes, gently but firmly, and that was the last time Freya saw her brother's face except through the phone screen via photos sent by strangers. She understood the rules of the game. She had signed them in red ink. That night, in the room prepared for her at some hotel Vale's people had arranged in advance, Freya sat at the small desk and wrote the most difficult letter of her life. She wrote that she had found a live and caregiving job for a wealthy family out on the West Coast, with wages so high she couldn't refuse, enough to pay off the enormous hospital debt that had weighed on the two of them for months. She wrote that the job required her to live far away, that she would call less often, that he shouldn't worry about her, shouldn't look for her, should only focus on living, getting healthy, and growing into a good man. She wrote that she loved him more than her own life, and that was the only sentence in the entire letter that wasn't a lie. Her hand trembled so badly she had to rewrite it 3 times, and each time she tore up a ruined page, she felt as though she were tearing a small piece out of herself. She thought of the run-down apartment on the South Side, where the two of them had shared every box of noodles, every winter, without enough money for heat. Every night she came home late with her hands cracked from chemicals, and Arlo always saved her the last piece of bread. She thought of the parents who had left too soon in an accident she could still hear in her dreams, and of the silent promise she had made herself when she was 22, that no matter what happened, she would never let Arlo be orphaned a second time. Now, to keep him alive, she was being forced to disappear from his life, and the irony was so bitter she almost laughed through her tears. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the hotel at the exact appointed hour, not 1 minute early and not 1 minute late, because in Constantine Vale's world, even time had to obey. The driver silently opened the door for her, and Freya stepped into the cold leather interior, with a small cloth bag that held everything left of her old life, a few faded sets of clothes and a family photograph with curled corners. As the car began to move, she looked back through the dark tinted glass, watching the city where she had lived her entire life recede behind her. The familiar buildings, the streets she had once walked home through at night, everything growing smaller, and then fading like a dream from which she was being forced awake. She did not know where she was being taken, did not know what tomorrow would look like, did not know whether she would ever hear Arlo's voice again. She knew only one thing, that her brother was breathing, that his small heart was beating, and that if the price of that miracle was the rest of her life locked inside the gilded cage of a man she had only just met, then she had paid it, without regret, without turning back. The glass separated her from the world outside, and for the first time since everything had begun, Freya allowed herself to close her eyes and let the car carry her deeper into a life she still did not fully understand. The penthouse sat on the highest floor of Vale Tower in the heart of Chicago, a vast space with glass walls looking straight down at the city below, as though gazing over a miniature kingdom, and everything inside carried a beauty so cold, expensive, and silent that Freya always felt she should not breathe too loudly. They gave her an elegant gray maid's uniform, a work schedule printed down to every half hour, and a list of rooms she was allowed to enter, along with rooms where, if she crossed the threshold, there would be consequences no one bothered to explain clearly. She wiped tabletops that did not hold a single speck of dust, polished silver sets that had never once been used, changed fresh flower arrangements every morning, though guests almost never came. Yet, when her shift ended, and she changed into the costly silk nightgown left in her closet, the strange contrast would often make her stand motionless before the mirror. She could hardly recognize the woman looking back at her, a maid forced to wear the garments of a mistress, living inside a gilded cage after spending her day bending down to scrub the floor. Constantine Vale was almost a ghost inside his own home. He appeared and vanished, according to rules she could not begin to guess, always impeccably dressed even in the deepest hours of the night, always polite with such perfection that it became maddening, greeting her with the slight bow of a gentleman, calling her Miss Whitlock with a formality cold as ice, and never, not even once, allowing the distance between them to shrink to less than an arm's length. If she entered a room, he would subtly move to the other side. If she handed him a cup of coffee, he would wait until she set it down and stepped back before picking it up, as though the very nearness of another human being was something he would not permit himself to touch. That courtesy should have made her feel safe, but instead it unsettled her in a way she could not name, because behind that flawless shell she sensed something locked tight, a man who had imprisoned himself inside absolute control so completely that he no longer allowed himself to live. There was something else that troubled her during those first long nights, and that was the fact that Constantine Vale never seemed to sleep. Whether she woke at 2 o'clock in the morning to drink water, or quietly passed through the hallway at 4 o'clock, while the whole city still lay under darkness, she always saw golden light spilling from the crack beneath his study door, always heard the soft rustle of pages turning, or the faint sound of classical music drifting out, as though the man had been waiting for something for so many years that even he no longer remembered what it was. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she was only a shadow hired to keep this house clean, and that the less attention she paid to its master, the safer she would be. But in the second week, one evening, as she was quietly arranging books in the library, wiping dust from leather-bound spines that perhaps no one had opened in decades, he spoke from behind her, his voice low and smooth as velvet, nearly making her drop the book in her hands. He asked whether she knew what the book she had just touched was about, and when she stammered that she did not, he stepped a little closer, still maintaining his careful distance, and said it was a book about kings who lost everything, because They tried to hold on to what they believed they owned. Freya looked up at him, and for the first time since setting foot in this home, she caught in those cold gray eyes something that was not quite cruelty, but more like an ancient weariness, a loneliness so deep it was almost a wound. He said nothing more, only gave her a slight nod and turned away, leaving her standing in the silent library with the book in her hands and a question newly kindled inside her. One she knew she should not ask. What exactly was a man who owned this entire city so afraid of that he dared not touch another human being and dared not sleep? It happened on a Thursday evening, when Freya was carrying a tea tray through the hallway leading to the grand sitting room, and heard low, heavy voices drifting from behind a door left slightly ajar. She should have turned away, should have remembered the list of rooms she was not allowed to approach, but something in the tense stillness of the air made her feet feel nailed to the floor. And through the narrow gap she saw Constantine Vale seated in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, relaxed as though he were enjoying a leisurely evening, while before him stood an older man whose shoulders trembled even though the room was warm. He did not shout. He did not slam his hand against the table. His voice remained smooth as velvet, still polite enough to chill the blood, and it was that absolute calm that was the most frightening thing of all, because it showed that this man was so accustomed to moments like this that they no longer made his heart beat even a fraction faster. He recited the numbers to the other man, the names, the dates, every detail about the money that had vanished and the meetings that should never have happened, and with each sentence the man before him grew a little paler, because Constantine Vale knew everything. He always knew everything. And the fact that he had silently watched for so long, without saying a word, was more terrifying than any threat could have been. He asked the man about his family, not in a threatening tone, but with a false concern, even more chilling than an outright warning, asking about the daughter away at college, about the new house in the suburbs, and every word was an invisible cord tightening around the traitor's throat, a reminder that the man seated in the armchair held everything he loved in his hands. Then Constantine stood, stepped closer, and said something very softly that Freya could not hear, but she saw the other man nearly collapse, nodding over and over, stammering apologies before two silent men led him out of the room through the rear door. No loud sound rang out, nothing was broken, and precisely because of that, Freya stood rooted in the darkness of the hallway, still holding the tea tray that had gone cold, feeling a chill run down her spine, because she had just understood that the man she served did not need noise to make the whole world kneel. Yet in that same moment, while her mind was still reeling, she realized something else, something that unsettled her more than fear itself. In everything he had said, in every psychological blow he had dealt, not once had he threatened to harm the traitor's daughter. Not once had he mentioned laying a hand on the women or children in the man's family. Later, when she quietly asked around among the other staff, she slowly pieced together a strange picture of this man, that no matter how ruthless he was in his underworld, he still kept lines he never allowed anyone to cross, that he did not touch women or children, never involved himself in human trafficking, and had once removed men under his command without mercy when they dared violate that rule. It was a twisted kind of morality, a private code belonging to a man who lived outside the law, but it existed, and its existence confused Freya, because what true monster would still keep any principles at all? That night, as she stood silently in the kitchen trying to steady herself, Miles Drake appeared beside her without her noticing, the older man with gray streaked hair and seasoned eyes who served as Constantine's right hand. He did not scold her, did not raise his voice, only poured her a cup of hot tea and told her in a low, rough voice that in this house, curiosity was the most dangerous luxury a person like her could allow herself. He looked at her with eyes that held no malice, almost pity instead, and added that some things here were best left unseen, best left unknown, and that if she wanted to keep both herself and the person she loved safe, she should learn how to become invisible. Freya nodded, clutching the warm cup in hands that were still trembling. But deep inside, she knew it was already too late, because she had begun to see that man more clearly than she should, and once she had seen him, there was no way for her to turn back. The woman arrived on a weekend evening, and Freya knew from the moment the private elevator doors opened that this was the kind of woman who belonged to Constantine Vale's world in a way she never could. Vivian Marsh was an attorney. People said, with glossy black hair falling loose, a red silk dress clinging to her body, as though it had been sewn for every curve, and the confidence of someone who had never had to bend down and scrub another person's floor. She entered the penthouse as though it belonged to her, calling Constantine by his first name with an intimacy that made Freya stop in the hallway, the tray of wine in her hands suddenly heavy. Freya was ordered to bring the wine into the sitting room, and when she pushed the door open and stepped inside, she saw the two of them seated close together on the long sofa, Vivian leaning toward Constantine, placing a hand with red painted nails on the sleeve of his suit jacket, laughing softly at something in a low, seductive voice. Constantine did not remove that hand. He did not shift away the way he always did with Freya, did not raise the arm's length distance he kept from her like a sacred boundary. And it was that, the fact that he allowed someone else to touch him while he always drew away from her, that made something hot and bitter rise in Freya's chest so quickly she could not stop it. She set the wine tray down on the table with stiff fingers, lowered her head, and withdrew exactly as a maid was supposed to do. But when the door closed behind her and she stood alone in the dark hallway, she realized her heart was pounding from a feeling she had no right to feel, a burning jealousy so unreasonable and shameful that she almost dared not name it. She leaned back against the wall, pressing her palm to her chest as though she could force that feeling to sink back down, and a wave of disgust with herself swept over her. What was she, after all? She was a maid bought with her brother's life, a shadow hired to keep this house clean, a woman who had signed her name in red ink to an agreement that clearly said she must never love that man. She had no right to be jealous. She had no right to care who he let touch him or who he laughed with at night. And yet she was jealous, and that truth frightened her more than anything she had witnessed in this house, because it meant the rule she had once believed would be the easiest promise of her life to keep had begun to turn into a torment. Every time she told herself she was not allowed to love him, that very thought forced her to admit that there was something inside her that needed to be restrained, that her heart had quietly gone farther than she had ever permitted it to go. And hanging over all of it was the terrible price, the cold warning that the moment she fell in love with him would also be the moment everything keeping Arlo alive would stop, making fear and longing twist together inside her into a strangling cord she could not untangle. That night she did not sleep, lying on the unfamiliar soft bed and listening to the faint laughter drifting from the sitting room, then fading away when the woman in red left at some hour Freya did not know, and she cursed herself for feeling relieved when she heard the elevator doors close. The next morning, when she brought coffee into the study with dark circles beneath her eyes and a heart in turmoil, she found herself almost hoping for something, a glance, a word, any sign that the previous night had left something in him too. But Constantine Vale only looked up from the documents, greeted her with his usual coldly polite nod, thanked her in that even, distant voice, then lowered his eyes and continued reading, as though she did not exist, as though there had been no woman in red, as though there had never been anything between them except the relationship between a master and a servant, and that perfect indifference, instead of helping her come back to her senses, only made her heart more tangled, because she could not understand what she was yearning for from a man she was supposed to fear, and still less could she understand why his indifference hurt her so much. The young man's name was Danny, only about 19 or 20, one of the youngest men working under Constantine, and one night he staggered in through the rear entrance of the penthouse, with one sleeve soaked through and his face bloodless from both pain and fear. He did not dare go to a hospital, because in their world, a wound recorded in a hospital file was a question no one wanted to answer, and he did not dare trouble anyone either, intending only to quietly bandage himself and disappear before anyone noticed. But Freya saw him, and before she could even think about whether she was allowed to, she set down the laundry basket and rushed over to support him. She had once completed part of a nursing program, before life forced her out of the classroom, and her hands still remembered the basics, remembered how to stay calm when someone else was panicking. She found the first aid kit and cleaned the wound with movements both firm and gentle, talking to him softly as she worked so he could forget the pain, asking where he was from, whether his mother knew he was doing this kind of work. And little by little the young man stopped trembling and began answering her in a choked voice. as though it had been a very long time since anyone had asked after him like a human being rather than a tool. She bandaged him carefully, told him he had to keep the wound clean, had to rest, and when he stammered his thanks to her over and over again, she only smiled and told him he did not need to thank her for something people should do for one another. What Freya did not know was that Constantine Vale had been standing silently in the darkness at the end of the hallway from beginning to end, watching everything without saying a word. He had seen the way she treated the people his whole world considered replaceable pieces, the servants others passed by as though passing furniture, the guards who stood motionless beside doors, though no one had ever asked their names. Yet Freya remembered each name, asked after their children, saved a slice of cake for the man on the night shift, treated every person in this house with an ordinary respect that had nearly gone extinct in his world. That night, while she was washing her hands in the empty kitchen, he stepped inside, and this time he did not wear his usual distant courtesy, but looked at her with an unreadable gaze, half curious and half mocking. He asked why she bothered, why she wasted her kindness on a boy who would soon be nothing but a number in a world that did not care about kindness, a world where human lives were weighed like merchandise and goodness was only a weakness for others to exploit. His voice carried the cold derision of a man who had lived too long among terrible things to believe in anything else. But Freya did not retreat. She lifted her head, looked straight into his gray eyes, and said that no one was only a number, that the boy he had just mentioned had a mother somewhere worrying about him, had dreams and fears like anyone else, and that the day people stopped seeing one another as human beings was the day they lost the human part of themselves. She said she might be poor, might be only a maid scrubbing his floors, but that was the only thing she had left, the way she looked at other people, and she would not give it up no matter what golden tower she had to live inside. Constantine was silent for a long time after those words, and in that moment Freya saw something pass across his face, a fine crack in the perfect ice, as though she had touched something no one had dared speak to him about in a very long time. He did not mock her anymore. He only looked at her a moment longer, then quietly said that she was a strange woman before turning away and walking back into the familiar darkness of the house. But that night, for the first time, Freya felt she was not entirely a prisoner inside a gilded cage, but a human being who had made a monster stop and listen. It began with a forgotten file. One afternoon, while Freya was cleaning the study according to the schedule, dusting the broad dark wood surface of Constantine's desk, she accidentally knocked a stack of documents off the edge, and when she bent down to pick them up, her eyes caught a name that made her heart seem to stop, her brother's name, Arlo Whitlock, printed clearly on a sheet of paper among medical records. Her hands began to tremble as she quickly turned the pages, and an icy fear rose inside her, because for all these months she had tried not to think about the most terrifying question of all, where the heart beating inside her brother's chest had come from. The rumors about Constantine Vale always spoke of an underground medical network, of impossible things arranged in the dark, and in that instant her imagination rushed toward the most horrifying places, toward the thought that perhaps Arlo's life had been exchanged for the life of some innocent person, that she had unknowingly become an accomplice in a crime she would never be able to forgive herself for. She sank down onto the study floor, clutching the file to her chest, and read each line with tear-blurred eyes, preparing herself for the worst. But what she read was not at all the thing she feared. Those pages were not evidence of a crime, but the trail of something almost opposite. She read that the enormous hospital debts that had weighed on the two of them, every last dollar, had been paid in full. She read that Arlo's expired insurance file, the devastating paperwork error that had caused him to be removed from the priority list, simply because her family was too poor to keep up with all those tangled procedures, had been restored and corrected properly by an entire team of lawyers and medical specialists. She read that Arlo's name had been placed back on the transplant waiting list legally, in the exact position he should have held if not for those cruel, administrative mistakes, and that the heart that saved him had come from a donor who had legally passed away, some stranger who had chosen to give away the final gift of their life. Constantine Vale had not bought a heart in the shadows. He had not stolen anyone's life. What he had done, with all the power and money and connections he possessed, was untie every knot in the system that had abandoned her brother, pay debts she could never have repaid, hire the best people to fix what had been done wrong, and return Arlo to his rightful place among those waiting for a lawful miracle. Freya sat there for a long time on the cold floor, the file trembling in her hands, and felt her entire understanding of this man begin to crack apart piece by piece. For all these months, she had seen him as a monster, a ruthless man who had bought her life with her brother's survival, a cold boss who treated people like chess pieces. But the man who had done everything recorded in this file, the man who had quietly saved Arlo through the hardest, most expensive, and most honest path when he could so easily have chosen a darker one, did not match the monster she had built in her mind. He had never told her this. He had never tried to make her grateful, never used it to demand anything from her, and had simply let her keep believing she had sold her soul to a devil. And that silence, the way he hid the best thing he had ever done, as though it were a shameful secret, moved Freya even more than the act itself. She wiped her tears, carefully arranged the file back in its original place, and left the study with her heart heavy under a new and frightening feeling, because she had just realized that the man she was supposed to hate, the man she was forbidden to love, was far better than the cold, merciless face he deliberately wore, and that keeping herself from loving him was about to become far harder than she had ever imagined. After the night she read the file, something changed in the way Freya looked at that man, and it seemed he sensed the change as well, because the brief conversations between them began to stretch longer, deeper, crossing beyond the dry boundary between a master and a servant. Constantine began lingering in the library on the nights she cleaned, sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace, with a glass of liquor that never seemed to empty, and they talked about books, about the history of empires that had fallen, about human nature and the things that made people become good or cruel. He was astonishingly intelligent, sharp and learned, but beneath every sentence he spoke, there was always an ancient sadness that Freya recognized more clearly with every passing day. One rainy night, while the whole city was wrapped in the steady sound of water falling beyond the glass walls, she found him sitting alone in the darkness of the sitting room, no lights on, only the pale glow of the city spilling across the side of his face. She meant to withdraw quietly, but he spoke and asked her to stay, and in that dark space, where no one had to look too clearly into anyone else's eyes, he said things she had never heard him say before. He told her that there were kinds of loneliness money and power could never touch, that he had lived too long in a world where every relationship was an exchange, and every human being could become a weapon used against him. Then he was silent for a very long time, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped so low it almost dissolved into the rain, as he admitted that there had once been someone, a very long time ago, someone he had allowed himself to care about, and that he had lost that person in a way that taught him a lesson he never forgot. He did not say that person's name. He did not tell her how it had happened. He only left the sentence hanging in the darkness, like an old wound that had never healed, and then stopped, as though he had already said more than he allowed himself to say, and Freya understood that she should not ask more. Instead, she sat down in the chair opposite him, at exactly the familiar distance between them, and began telling him about her own life, perhaps so he would not have to sit alone inside his sorrow. She told him about her parents, about the fateful night when one phone call split her life into before and after, about how she had been only 22 when she had to leave school unfinished, setting aside her dream of working in the medical field, so she could take on every kind of manual job to raise her little brother, who had still been far too young. She told him about the cold winters in their run-down apartment, about the silent promise she had made to herself that she would never let Arlo be orphaned a second time, and about the way her own dream kept moving farther and farther away, until it became something she only remembered now and then before tucking it away again. As she spoke, tears slipped down her face without her noticing, and she only startled when she felt something. Constantine had left his chair, had crossed the arm's-length distance he had not broken even once through all those months, and now he was standing before her, lifting his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek with a tenderness so startling that both of them went still. It was the first time he had touched her. His hand was warmer than she had imagined, and an invisible current passed between them, something both frightening and sweet, both forbidden and impossible to resist. In that moment, beneath the pale city light and the sound of rain against the glass, They both knew that some wall between them had just collapsed, and that no matter how hard they pretended, they could no longer return to being only a master and a servant. Constantine was the one who pulled his hand back first, stepping away as though he had touched fire, a flash of panic crossing his face in a way she had never seen before. And he quietly left the room, leaving Freya sitting alone with her wildly beating heart and the truth she could no longer deny, that she was falling in love, and that love was the one thing absolutely forbidden to her. In the days after that rainy night, the air between them grew thick, with a tension they both tried to pretend not to notice. A clumsy avoidance replacing the cold distance from before, because now, every time their eyes met, they both knew too well what was growing between them. Then one evening, when Freya reached up to place a book on a high shelf in the library and nearly lost her balance, Constantine was there, catching her with a reflex so quick, neither of them had time to think, and suddenly they were standing too close, close enough that she could hear his breathing, close enough that the arm's length distance he had kept like a sacred boundary for months dissolved into nothing. He looked down at her, his gray eyes no longer holding any ice, but instead a fire that had been restrained for far too long, and Freya felt the whole world hold its breath as his face lowered slowly toward hers. She had closed her eyes. She had let the moment come so near that only one breath remained between them. But then, at the same time, they both startled and stepped back as though they had touched real flame, both remembering the line that could not be crossed hanging between them like a blade. Constantine turned away, his hand clenched into a fist, and left the library without a word, leaving Freya standing there with her heart pounding and her lips still trembling from a kiss that had never happened. That night she could not sleep, and while she tossed restlessly, a strange thought began to creep into her mind. She realized that through all these months, no one had ever truly chained her. There was no lock on her bedroom door, no bars across the windows, no guard standing in her way. Physically, she could step into that elevator at any time, go down to the ground floor, walk out through the gates, and disappear into the city, and no hand would pull her back. The cage that held her was not made of iron or steel. But that very realization made her heart tighten, because she understood at once that bodily freedom meant nothing at all. The real chain binding her was not in any door or window bars, but in the agreement she had signed in red ink, in the cold rule Constantine had laid down, that the moment she fell in love with him would also be the moment everything keeping Arlo alive would stop. She could leave this tower on her own 2 feet, but she could not leave the condition that tied her brother's life to her heart, and that was the true prison, a prison without walls, in which she had locked herself because of her love for her brother. And there was an even crueler truth she was forced to face in that long night, that even if there were no chain at all, even if she were truly free to walk away, she would no longer leave. She told herself she stayed for Arlo, that she had no other choice, that everything she did was for the brother who was breathing, because of the patience of the man who lived at the top of this tower. She repeated that to herself over and over like a spell, like a shield to protect herself. But deep inside, in the place where a person cannot lie to herself in the quiet of the night, Freya knew she was deceiving herself. She did not stay only for Arlo. She stayed because she could not bear the thought of living without hearing Constantine's deep, warm voice in the library, without seeing the fragile crack in the ice when he thought no one was looking, without being near the man she was supposed to see as an enemy but could not stop thinking about. And that truth, the truth that she had fallen in love with him, despite knowing that love could kill her brother, made her bury her face in the pillow and cry in silence, trapped between 2 loves that could not be reconciled, with no escape, no answer, only a heart betraying the very vow it had sworn to keep. The tension began to show inside the house in a different way. No longer the sweet tension between 2 people, but something much darker and far more dangerous, slipping through closed doors and midnight phone calls. Freya recognized it in the way Constantine changed, in how he grew quieter and more watchful, in the urgent meetings held behind the study door until morning, and in Miles Drake's grave face each time he stepped out of those meetings. She was not allowed to know the details, but she did not need to be an insider to feel that something had gone seriously wrong inside this man's empire. Through broken pieces of conversation overheard when she brought coffee into the room, through sentences cut short whenever she came too near, She gradually pieced together a frightening picture. Information that only a very small number of people should have known had somehow leaked out. Secret meeting places were discovered by enemies in advance. Plans that had seemed tightly sealed were suddenly blocked, as though someone had warned the other side ahead of time. A shipment was lost, a negotiation ruined, an ally abruptly turned away at the worst possible moment. All of it could be explained by only one possibility, a possibility that made even Constantine Vale, the man who always controlled everything, reveal for the first time something close to unease. There was a traitor inside this very house, a snake hidden among the most trusted men, someone who had sat at the same table, had been given trust, had known the secrets only the innermost circle was allowed to know. And what made everything even more suffocating was that no one knew who it was. Suspicion began to poison the air inside the house, turning once familiar eyes into strangers, making every person in the tower look at the one beside them with a silent question. Freya watched Constantine quietly examine each person, each call, each transaction, following thin threads through a maze of lies. And she saw in his eyes the bitter exhaustion of a man who had grown so accustomed to betrayal that it no longer surprised him, leaving only the dull ache of having to learn once again that he could trust no one. One night, as she quietly cleared away coffee cups after a meeting had ended, she accidentally heard the last fragment of a conversation between Constantine and Miles, and those words sent a chill down her spine. The clues, however fragile, seemed to point toward one of the most trusted men, a high-ranking subordinate who had stood beside Constantine for many years, someone whose betrayal, if true, would be a knife driven from the place closest to the heart. But there was one thing neither Constantine nor Miles knew yet, one thing even Freya could never have imagined, that this traitor had been silently watching everything inside the house for a very long time, and in the process, he had seen the one thing Constantine had tried to hide more carefully than any other secret. He had seen how the most powerful man in Chicago, the man who never allowed anyone closer than an arm's length, had broken his own boundary for a maid. He had seen Constantine's gaze soften when he looked at Freya, had seen him linger in the library on the nights she cleaned, had seen the way a man who was always cold suddenly revealed a crack whenever she entered the room. And that traitor understood that inside an empire guarded with perfect caution, beyond all the steel walls and bodyguards and layers of defenses that seemed impossible to penetrate, this invincible man still had one weakness after all, one single opening through which he could be struck, and that weakness was not money or power or territory, but a woman with calloused hands and a heart far too kind. While Freya lay awake worrying for the man she loved, she did not know that the love blooming between them, the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to them both, was about to become the most dangerous weapon that could be used to destroy them. Although Freya had promised herself she would honor the agreement and disappear from Arlo's life, she still could not resist secretly watching over him from afar, through the public social media pages he sometimes posted on, through the photographs he took with friends, through every small sign that he was still alive, still healthy, still growing into the young man she had always dreamed he would become. It was her only secret comfort, the last fragile thread connecting her to the brother for whom she had sacrificed everything. But then one afternoon, as she was scrolling through those photographs as usual, an icy feeling suddenly ran down her spine. In one photo Arlo had taken in front of his school, far behind him, blurred among the crowd, there was a car parked across the street that she felt certain she had seen in another picture, on another day, in another place. She told herself she was imagining things, that her constant worry had made her suspicious, but the unease clung to her and would not let go. In the days that followed, she began paying closer attention, and the more she looked, the more she saw things that made her heart tighten. A strange figure appearing at the edge of the photographs, an unfamiliar car showing up too many times in places her brother went, something wrong drifting around Arlo's seemingly peaceful life. She had no clear proof, only the instinct of a sister who had spent her youth protecting her little brother, and that instinct was screaming at her that someone was watching him, that the dark world she had stepped into to save him was now stretching its shadow toward the very person she most wanted to keep safe. Panic rose inside Freya like a black tide. She had traded her entire life, had given up freedom, had locked herself inside a gilded cage, had accepted the harshest conditions, all so Arlo could live an ordinary, safe life, far from every danger. Yet now, the very price she had paid to save him was pulling him into danger, and the cruel irony of it made it nearly impossible for her to breathe. She realized that if some enemy wanted to hurt Constantine, wanted to find his weakness, then the bond between her and her brother was the fatal opening, and if that enemy had found Arlo, it meant they knew about her, knew what she meant to the man at the top of this tower, knew something no one was supposed to know. In desperation, she ran to find Constantine, trembling as she told him everything she suspected, the blurred figures, the unfamiliar cars, the fear that was choking her. She had prepared herself for him to dismiss it, to tell her she was imagining things, but instead, Constantine's face darkened in a way that frightened her even more, because it told her that her fear was not baseless at all. He did not say much. He only clenched his jaw, his gray eyes flashing with a cold and dangerous light, and told her that nothing would happen to her brother, that she had to trust him. What Freya did not see was that very night, in the darkness behind closed doors, Constantine quietly mobilized the most trusted men he had left, silently building an invisible ring of protection around Arlo, people who would watch the boy from a distance without him ever knowing, ready to intervene if that threatening shadow came any closer. He did all of it without telling Freya, without trying to make her grateful, just as he had quietly saved Arlo from the beginning, because for this man, protecting what she loved had become something he did in silence, a language of love he did not know how to speak aloud. But both of them understood, though neither said it, that something had changed forever, that the shadow had reached the doorstep of the innocent, and that the war they had thought still lingered somewhere, far away, had now come very close. The rain that night poured over Chicago, as though the sky already knew what was about to happen. Constantine was preparing to leave in his familiar black suit, and when Freya caught sight of him in the hallway, she immediately sensed something different in the way he fastened his jacket, a heaviness he tried to hide behind his usual composure. He told her he was going to meet someone that night, a negotiation to end the threat hanging over them, one final attempt to arrange a truce with the rival named Raymond Kessler, the man who had stretched his dark shadow toward Arlo. He told her to stay inside the penthouse, not to step out, not to open the door for anyone, and in the brief moment before he turned away, he stopped and looked at her longer than usual, as though he wanted to say something, but in the end said nothing at all. Then the elevator doors closed, and he vanished into the stormy night. Freya remained alone in the vast penthouse, listening to the rain lash against the glass walls, and a grim premonition kept growing inside her chest with every minute that passed. She could not sit still. She paced back and forth, holding herself tightly, watching the clock count each moment, and the longer she waited, the more uneasy she became, because something in his eyes when he left had looked like a farewell. The deeper the night grew, the more suffocating the silence in the house became, until it was torn open by the sound of the elevator rushing upward and hurried footsteps. Miles Drake burst in, and from the look on that seasoned man's face alone, Freya knew the worst had happened. He tried to keep his voice calm, tried to shield her from the truth, but she clung to him, begged him to say it, and in the end, the shattered pieces of the disaster came through the frantic phone calls she overheard when Miles could not stop her in time. The negotiation had never been real. It was a trap, laid with perfect care, and whoever said it knew exactly which road Constantine's convoy would take, at what hour, with how many men escorting him, because the information had been leaked from inside, from the very snake hidden in the house that he had not yet had time to drag into the light. The convoy had been stopped on an empty road in the rain, ambushed by Kessler's men, and in the chaos Constantine had been wounded, captured, and taken to some abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city where no one could find him. The loyal men he still had left were scattered everywhere, pinned down by simultaneous attacks, Kessler launched at the same time, so no one could reach him in time. Freya listened to all of it with her legs nearly giving way, one hand gripping the back of a chair to keep herself from falling. But what made her heart seem to stop was the final sentence, the message Kessler had sent, cold and cruel as a sentence of death. He did not demand money. He did not demand territory. He knew exactly what could break the invincible man, and he named that as the price. He wanted Freya. He wanted the maid all of Chicago had begun whispering was Constantine Vale's only weakness, and he offered a deal so simple it was chilling. that if she willingly handed herself over to him, he would release Constantine. But if she did not, the man lying gravely wounded in that warehouse would not live until dawn. Miles looked at her with anguish in his eyes, and in a hoarse voice he told her she was not allowed to even think about it, that this was exactly what Constantine had sacrificed everything to prevent, that his duty was to keep her safe at any cost, even if that meant losing his own master. But Freya almost could not hear him anymore. In her head, only one truth rang out, terrible and brutally clear, that the man she loved was dying somewhere in the rain, that his life now rested in her hands, and that the boundary she had sworn never to cross was about to force her to make a choice no one could truly make. Freya retreated into her room and stood motionless in the dark, her heart torn in 2x2 cords pulling in opposite directions, and in her mind that cold rule rang over and over like a death bell. The moment she fell in love with him would be the moment everything keeping Arlo alive would stop. And now, rushing into the rain to save Constantine, placing her own life on the scale in exchange for his, what else could it mean except admitting that she loved him enough to risk everything? If she did it, by the rule he had set, her brother would die. If she did not do it, the man she loved would die. This was the cruelest trap fate could set for a person, forcing her to choose between the two people she loved most in the world, and whichever choice she made, she would lose half her heart. She collapsed to her knees on the floor, her trembling hands clutching her head, and for a moment she felt completely paralyzed by the impossibility of that choice. But then, from deep inside her despair, something else began to rise within her, a cold calm she herself had not expected. She thought of Arlo, of how he had been saved, had grown healthy, had an entire invisible circle of protection that Constantine had quietly built around him. She thought of the man lying gravely wounded in that cold warehouse, the man who had silently saved her brother by the most honest path, the man who had touched her heart in a way she could no longer deny. And she realized that she could not sit still and let him die, could not live the rest of her life knowing she'd had a chance to save him and had done nothing. But she was not a fool throwing herself blindly into fire either. She had no gun, no strength, no army under her command. The only thing she had was herself, the very thing Kessler wanted to take, and if her body was the only card on this board, then she would play it as wisely as she possibly could. In her mind, a plan began to take shape, fragile and full of risk, but still better than surrender. She would willingly give herself to Kessler exactly as he demanded, would walk into the wolf's den on her own 2 feet, but she would not walk in empty-handed. She found a small voice recorder, something she carefully hid inside the layers of her clothing, a device that would capture every word the enemy spoke, every confession of crime that could become a weapon to overturn the entire game. Then she did something even more reckless. She secretly sent Miles the location where Kessler had arranged to meet, knowing that even though Constantine's men had been scattered, there was still a chance they could arrive in time if she stalled long enough. And most important of all, while shaping that plan, she suddenly understood something she might be able to use, that the person who had informed Kessler, the snake hidden inside the house whom Constantine had not yet dragged into the light, would surely be there tonight as well to witness the fruit of his betrayal. And if she was clever enough, she could make that traitor reveal himself in front of everyone. When she rose from the floor and wiped away the last of her tears, Freya was no longer the trembling maid who had signed her name in red ink months before. She was still afraid enough that her hands and feet were cold, but that fear was now overshadowed by something greater, the iron resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose except the 2 people she loved. She put on her coat, drew in a deep breath, and walked toward the elevator with steps that were strangely steady. The elevator doors opened before her like a black mouth leading down into hell, and Freya stepped inside, carrying her wildly pounding heart, a hidden voice recorder, and the silent prayer that tonight she would not lose everything she loved. The warehouse stood in an abandoned industrial district on the edge of the city, a cold gray block of concrete in the rain, and when Freya stepped inside through the rusted iron door, she saw Constantine sitting there, tied to a chair in the middle of the empty space, his face pale and exhausted, one side of his shirt darkened by a wound she did not dare look at for long. When his eyes met hers, something broke open in those gray depths, not relief, but absolute horror, and he growled at her to leave immediately, that she was not allowed to be there, that she was throwing everything away. But Freya did not step back. She stood straight in the freezing warehouse, facing Raymond Kessler, who stood there with the triumphant smile of a man who believed he had won the entire game, and she did the one thing she had sworn never to do. She looked straight at Constantine and said, in a voice that trembled but remained clear, that she loved him. She said she had loved him for a very long time, that she knew what that meant, knew the price she might have to pay, and that if this love forced her to suffer the most terrible consequence, then she would accept it as long as he lived. Those words seemed to leave Constantine dead silent, his face twisting with a pain greater than the wound in his body. But Freya had already turned away, directing her attention toward Kessler to buy precious time. She pretended to surrender, pretended to accept his offer, and skillfully drew out the enemy's arrogance, asking how he could have set such a perfect trap. And Kessler, like every villain drunk on victory, began to boast. He spoke of the insider who had sold Constantine out, of the information leaked from within, of how patiently he had waited for months to find the weakness of the invincible man. And the tiny recorder hidden inside Freya's clothing quietly captured every word. The more Kessler spoke, the more pleased with himself he became, and then he let slip a sentence that froze the whole space, that this was not the first time he had used this tactic, that he had done exactly the same thing once before, with Constantine's previous woman. The sentence struck like a knife through the man tied to the chair, and Freya saw something dark and agonized flash in his eyes, an old wound torn open again. But before she could fully understand its meaning, everything erupted. At the exact moment Kessler finished speaking, the warehouse door burst open, and Miles and the remaining loyal men of Constantine stormed in amid chaos, shouts, and bodies rushing through the dim light. In the middle of that turmoil, something unexpected happened. The insider who had been standing among Kessler's men was before everyone. The face of the traitor Constantine had once trusted most revealed beneath the lights, and the truth laid bare left him no room to deny it. In the fiercest moment of the struggle, when everything became confused and dangerous, Freya saw the threat aimed at Constantine while he was still bound and helpless, and without a second of hesitation, she threw herself forward, placing her body between danger and the man she loved. A dry, brutal sound cracked through the air, and Freya felt a burning pain pierce through her, her legs folding beneath her as the world around her began to sway and blur. She heard, as though from a place very far away, Constantine screaming her name, a heart-torn cry from the man who had never allowed anyone to see him lose control, a cry carrying all the fear and despair he had buried for so many years. He fought wildly against the ropes binding him, no longer the cold and powerful boss, only a man forced to watch the woman he loved fall before his eyes all over again. Freya felt herself falling, slipping slowly into darkness, but the last thing she managed to think, with a faint smile on her lips, was that at least this time she had not stood still, she had chosen, and she had saved the person she loved. When Freya woke, the first thing she felt was a dull ache spreading through her whole body, and the familiar smell of antiseptic in a room equipped like a private infirmary. Gentle light filtered through the heavy curtains, and it took her a long while to remember where she was, to remember the cold warehouse, the chaos, the moment she had thrown herself forward to shield the man she loved, and the burning sensation that had pierced through her. Before everything sank into darkness, she was alive. Somehow she had been saved, brought back here, pulled from death's grasp by the best medical hands money could summon. But as soon as her awareness fully returned, another terror, colder than death itself, crashed over her because she remembered what she had done. She had said it. She had stood in the middle of that warehouse and admitted in front of everyone that she loved Constantine. She had placed her own life on the scale to save him. She had crossed the one line she had sworn never to cross, and according to the cold rule he had laid down, according to the agreement she had signed in red ink, the moment she fell in love with him was also the moment everything keeping Arlo alive would stop. She had saved the man she loved, but to do it, she might have killed the little brother she had sacrificed her whole life to protect. That truth choked her, and she jolted upright in a panic, even as her wounded body screamed in protest, her eyes wide with terror as they searched the room. Constantine was sitting there, right beside her bed, and she could see that he had been sitting there for a very long time, perhaps for many hours, his face gaunt and exhausted, one side of his body still bearing the traces of the wound from the night before. But what made Freya's heart tighten was not his weariness, but the expression on his face. He was not looking at her with the relief of a man who had just seen the woman he loved escape the scythe of death. Instead, his face was distorted by a deep horror, a torment so painful that she almost could not recognize this man who had always been absolute calm itself. When he spoke, his voice broke in a way she had never heard before, and he uttered the words like an accusation against himself. "What have you done?" He repeated the question as though he could not believe it. "What have you done, Freya?" And there was no blame for her in his voice, only a pain so devastating that it seemed he was the one who had just committed an unforgivable crime. He was still clinging to his lie, still letting her believe that her love had triggered that cruel clause, and Freya looked at the despair on his face and misunderstood its meaning completely, thinking he was in agony because he knew her brother was no longer protected. A sob broke from her chest, and she began trembling violently, her hands groping for anything that could help her contact the outside world. She begged, her voice breaking between sobs, that she needed a phone, that she had to call Arlo immediately, that she had to know whether her brother was still alive, that she could not bear another second inside this terrible unknowing. She tried to sit up, despite the pain, despite the hands trying to keep her lying still, because in her mind there was now only one fear overshadowing everything else, the fear that she had traded her brother's life for the life of the man she loved, that she had been forced to make that impossible choice and now had to live with its consequences. Constantine watched her struggle in that anguish, watched the woman who had nearly died for him now falling apart, because of a fear he himself had planted in her heart, and something in his eyes began to change, as though the weight of the lie he had carried all these months had finally become too much to bear. Freya's trembling hand finally reached the phone someone had placed in her grasp, and through a blur of tears, she pressed the numbers she knew by heart, the number of the facility where Arlo was being cared for, praying in desperation that someone would answer. The phone rang once, again, every waiting second stretching as long as a century, and then a voice came through on the other end, calm and warm, asking what she needed. Freya choked out a question about her brother, asking whether Arlo Whitlock was all right, whether anything had happened to him last night, and she gripped the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, bracing herself for terrible news. But the voice only sounded surprised, then cheerfully answered that Arlo was perfectly healthy, that he had just gone through a routine checkup with wonderful results, that the new heart was working beautifully, and that in fact the boy had sent a message asking about his sister not long ago, still speaking of her with all the love in the world. Freya sat there, the phone pressed to her ear, and it took a long while for those words to sink into her reeling mind. Arlo was all right. Arlo was still healthy, still safe, still living an ordinary life somewhere, completely unharmed. Nothing had happened at all. The terrible thing she had been so certain would fall, the cruel consequence she had prepared herself to bear, had not come. She lowered the phone, her hands numb, and looked up at Constantine with utter confusion written across her tear-soaked face. She stammered, unable to understand, that her brother was still fine, that she had loved him, had admitted it in front of everyone, had broken the rule he had set, and yet nothing had happened to Arlo. Why? How could that be possible? And when she looked into his eyes for an answer, what she saw there was not surprise, but something else, a heavy surrender. The face of a man who knew the moment he had been avoiding for all these months had finally arrived. Constantine closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering all his courage, and when he opened them again, he looked straight at her and spoke the truth he had buried for far too long. He said there had never been any clause like that at all, that no thread had ever existed tying her feelings to her brother's life. Saving Arlo, paying the debts, restoring him to the list, all of it had been completed long ago, fully and unconditionally, in a way that could not be reversed, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that her heart could do to change it. Her brother had been safe from the moment he signed those papers, safe whether she loved him or hated him, safe no matter what she did or felt. The law of the heart, the cruel condition that had hung over her head all these months, that had made her live in fear every second of every day, that had forced her to restrain her feelings as though they were a murder weapon, none of it had ever been true. It was a lie. Freya sat frozen on the sickbed, letting those words strike her in wave after wave, and felt the entire world she had built over all those months, every fear, every restraint, every night she had buried her face in the pillow and cried because she was not allowed to love. All of it collapsed into ruins beneath the weight of a single truth: that she had never had to choose at all, that the prison without walls where she had locked herself had never been real. In the heavy silence that followed that confession, Freya finally managed to ask the question tearing her apart. Why had he done it? Why had he built such a cruel lie, forcing her to live in fear every second of every day, forcing her to restrain her own heart as though loving him were a crime that could kill someone? Constantine did not answer right away. He lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly together, and when he spoke, his voice sank low and carried the weight of something that had been locked away for many years. He began to tell her, for the first time in his life, about the woman whose name had haunted him for the past 8 years. Her name was Nadia. 8 years ago, when he had been younger, before he had built walls of ice around his heart, he had loved completely and fiercely, the way only a man who had never learned fear could love. Nadia had been his fiancée, the only light in the dark world he had chosen to enter, and he had not hidden that love at all. He had let the whole world know that this woman was everything to him. And that had been his fatal mistake, because in the world where he lived, love was not a blessing but a weakness, an opening for enemies to pierce through, a target already drawn on the backs of those he dared to love. His enemies at the time had seen that, had understood that the only way to break an invincible man was not to attack his strength, but to steal away the thing that made him soft. And they had acted. They had taken Nadia from him, had used her as a chess piece, as a message sent directly to him, and though he had done everything he could, had traded everything, he still could not save her. He had lost her in the cruelest way, and he had been forced to go on living with the knowledge that his own love, the very fact that he had allowed himself to love openly and unguardedly, had made her a target and had ultimately killed her. From that day on, a dark belief took root in his soul and never let go. The belief that anyone he allowed to love him, anyone he let near his heart, would become a target, would die because of that closeness. That was why he built those walls, why he never let anyone come closer than an arm's length, why he had lived for 8 years in chosen loneliness as a form of penance. Then Freya entered his life, and he realized with horror that she carried within her the very flame he had once loved and lost, the same courage, the same fierce loyalty, the same heart far too kind for the world around her. He knew almost immediately that if he allowed things to unfold naturally, she would love him, and he would love her, and then history would repeat itself, and another woman would die because she had dared to love a monster like him. He could not bear that thought, and so he had done the only thing he believed could protect her. He had created the law of the heart, that cruel but desperate lie, because he had seen through her from the very beginning and understood that for Freya, nothing in the world mattered more than her brother's life. He knew that if he tied her love to Arlo's survival, she would never dare cross that line, would build a wall within herself that no power of his could ever have built. It was the only way he could think of to keep her beside him, without turning her into a target, to be near her light every day, without dragging her into the darkness, where the people he loved were doomed to die. He said he had lied to her not because he did not love her, but precisely because he loved her too much, enough that he would rather endure her never loving him back than have to bury her, as he had once buried Nadia. Constantine's confession hung in the room like something that had finally been set free after too many years in captivity, and in the first moment, a hot fury rose inside Freya, a righteous anger for all the nights she had cried, all the times she had torn her own heart apart, all the fear she had been forced to carry because of a lie. She wanted to scream in his face that he had no right, that he had stolen from her the right to choose, had turned the most beautiful love of her life into a prison. But when she looked at the man sitting before her, when she saw the naked pain in those gray eyes, her anger began to melt into something deeper and far more painful, an understanding that left her speechless. She realized that this man had not built that lie out of cruelty, but out of a fear that had been eating away at him for 8 long years, an unhealed wound he had carried in solitude, never daring to share it with anyone. And then, as tears rolled down her cheeks, Freya said the thing both he and she needed to hear. She said she understood how terrified he had been, understood that he had loved Nadia and lost her, and had carried the blame for that death by himself for all these years. But she told him to look back at tonight, to truly look at what he had done, because the man from 8 years ago, the man he still believed himself to be forever, would have done something completely different. Tonight, when she rushed into that warehouse, when she placed herself in danger, he could have chosen the safest path. He could have hidden behind the walls of ice he had built, could have let his boundary stop him, could have watched from a distance and kept his heart from ever having to break again. He could have let her die and told himself that was the price of keeping himself safe inside his loneliness. But he had not done that. When she fell, he had screamed her name with everything left inside his chest, had fought wildly to reach her, had let the whole world see him lose control, had laid his heart bare in broad daylight despite every danger. He was no longer the one who stood watching from far away. He was no longer the man who let fear control him. In the most important moment, he had chosen love instead of fear, had chosen to rush forward instead of hiding, and that very choice proved he was no longer the man from 8 years ago. Freya took his hand, the hand once stained by the blood of a dark world, and told him in a gentle but steady voice that she was not naive, that she knew he had done things she could not forgive, knew that his past was full of shadows her love could never erase. Her love was not a miracle that could wash all sins clean, not a cloth to cover everything he had done, but what that love could do, what it was doing right now, was give him a chance, the right to heal, the possibility of choosing a different road from this moment on. Because no person, no matter how far they had fallen, no matter how terrible the things they had done, was forever defined by the worst thing they had ever done. She said he was not the devil he had locked himself into becoming as punishment, not the cold-blooded killer the underworld feared, but a human being who had suffered, who had loved, who had lost, and who now stood before the chance to love again if he dared. And as those words sank into him, Freya saw something perhaps no one had ever been allowed to see. The eyes of the most powerful man in Chicago filling with tears, the final layer of ice around his heart at last melting away, and he lowered his head, pressing his forehead against her hand, like a man who had just been forgiven after too many years of condemning himself. The small recorder Freya had risked her life to hide inside her clothing turned out to be the strongest weapon in the entire game, because every triumphant boast from Raymond Kessler had been recorded in full. Every confession about the crimes he had committed, about the insider he had bought, about even the dark things he had done in the past. After recovering, Constantine did not choose the path of violent revenge the underworld usually took. Instead, together with Miles, he quietly handed the entire recording and the evidence they had gathered over all those months to a federal prosecutor known for integrity, a person who could not be bought, and let real justice do its work. The insider Constantine had once trusted most, the man who had betrayed an entire empire for greed, along with Raymond Kessler and his criminal network, were brought into the light one by one and forced to pay before the law. And within that evidence, after so many years buried in darkness, the truth about Nadia's death was finally exposed, closing a circle of grief that had haunted Constantine for 8 long years, bringing the woman who had died a belated justice he had thought he would never be able to reclaim. When everything had settled, on a rare, clear morning, Constantine held in his hands the contract once written in red ink, the document that had bound Freya's life to his, and in front of her, he tore it in half. He told her she had never truly been his property, that she was free, completely free, able to walk out that door at any moment and live the life she had lost, reunite with her brother, pursue the unfinished dream she had set aside. But he also said, in a quiet voice and for the first time full of the vulnerability of a man, daring to let himself be weak, that if she chose to stay, he hoped she would stay not because of a contract, not because anyone's life had been used to bind her, but simply because she wanted to. Freya looked at the man who had once been the devil in every whispered rumor, the man who had quietly saved her brother, the man who had lied to her because he was too afraid of losing her, the man who had burst out of the wall of his loneliness to pull her back from death, and she chose to stay. But she stayed in her own way, with her own conditions, because she was no longer the trembling maid she had once been. She told him that if she stayed, he had to begin stepping out of the darkest corners of the world he had built, had to slowly withdraw from the cruelest things, had to choose to become a better man every day, not because she forced him to, but because he himself deserved to live a life no longer devoured by darkness. and she told him she wanted to reunite with Arlo openly. No more secrecy, no more false letters, no more living like a shadow at the edge of her brother's life. Constantine agreed to everything, without a moment's hesitation. The moment Freya finally held her little brother in her arms after so many months of separation that had felt endless, was the most beautiful moment she had ever known. Arlo was now a healthy young man. Color had returned to his cheeks. The new heart beat steadily and strongly inside his chest, and when she told him the whole truth, about everything she had done, about everything she had sacrificed, the boy cried and held her tightly, and said he wasn't angry, that he understood, that he was only grateful his sister had finally come home. Standing there, between the arms of the brother she had saved and beside the man she had saved, Freya suddenly realized a truth so deep it nearly stole her breath. She had come to that house by the lake believing she was selling her own soul to buy her brother's life. But in the end, from the very beginning, she had been the one saving a soul, the soul of the man who had bought her, a soul that had seemed lost forever in darkness and loneliness, a soul only her kindness and love could pull back into the light. And that was something all the power and money in this world could never do. But a heart that knew how to see the human being inside a monster could. The story of Freya and Constantine leaves us with a simple yet profound lesson, that no one in this world is forever defined by the worst thing they have ever done, that behind the coldest walls often hide wounds waiting to be healed, and that the way we see and treat people, with respect and compassion even when they seem least deserving, can sometimes carry the power to change an entire life. Kindness is not weakness, but the strongest light that can guide a lost soul home. If this story has touched your heart, if it has moved you even for a single moment, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to many more moving and meaningful stories. We would truly love to know how you feel. So please leave a comment sharing the thoughts from deep within your heart, how you feel about Freya and Constantine's journey, and whether you believe love and kindness can truly transform a person. Thank you for listening to this story until the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life each day, and a peaceful soul. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.